Well, good evening. We've got another live broadcast for you. Hopefully, we don't run into the same technical issues that we did last time. But tonight we've got, as I said last week, we've got Michelle Stirling on, who is a potential future thought criminal. Maybe one day we'll share a cell in a gulag. But I think we've got some very interesting things to discuss with the documentary that she filmed. And well, we'll get into that in just a minute. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So it's my guest to welcome to the show Michelle Stirling. She is a researcher, journalist, author, and has, among a number of other projects, done a excellent documentary called The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane that we'll be talking about that and other topics related to that. You're probably wondering why I referred to as a potential future thought criminal. We'll get into all that, but first, Michelle, thank you for coming on to the show.
Important that we talk about this because Sugarcane just won Best True Crime Documentary at the Critics' Choice Award in LA.
Okay. Well, before we jump into that, I wonder if you could just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, because not all of them may be familiar with you and your work.
Okay, I did a number of documentaries in the 1980s with Dr. Hugh Dempsey as my research supervisor. Hotena is his Blackfoot name, and he was the curator of the Glenbow Museum. So as part of those documentaries, I traveled around Alberta mostly, southern Alberta mostly, and interviewed all kinds of people, including people like Grant McEwen, who was born in 1902. And so Dr. Dempsey helped direct the topics and reviewed all the materials that I researched and wrote, and gave me a great love of history. So that's why I'm involved in, how shall I say, residential school factualism.
Okay. And I guess, have you done any formal academic studies in that field? Or what
No,
is
I haven't.
your background? What's your background before you got into doing this investigative journalism and researching?
Well, I've always done things like documentaries. I once did a documentary on genocide. The producer found it so depressing that we never released it, but it was a very detailed research project. I worked with Claude Fournier and Marie-Josée Raymond in Quebec on the development of a 6-hour miniseries about the Riders of the Plains, about the Mounties Trek West, which was another extension of the historical work that I'd done with Dr. Dempsey. So I've done quite a few historical dramas, I guess you should say, but also a number of documentaries, and I also do some marketing communications.
And these documentaries and dramas you've done in the past, it sounds like those were on, I guess, legacy media or on television, were they?
Actually, the 6-hour miniseries never got produced. We hoped that it would have been produced for the 1988 Olympics, but we just missed sort of the corporate funding window. So it did get written, but it didn't get produced. So, smaller projects are easier to produce, and that's mostly what I do, like this mini doc where you have a very small crew. It's a quick turnaround, but you can actually tell a good story and a thorough story without having to go through layers and layers of approval.
Right. So, but before we get into your documentary, I actually wasn't familiar with the sugarcane documentary before I heard about your documentary. So, again, viewers may not necessarily be familiar with this, but Sugarcane's a documentary that's been put out by National Geographic. So, I mean, National Geographic has historically been held to be, one of the most reputable and incredible and well-researched and honest type of organizations. Up until the last few years, National Geographic didn't strike me as being particularly politicized. It seemed like they were just there to, show what the world looks like, show all these pictures. But they've started getting into the politics. I know there's the infamous thing with the transgender child that they put on the front page of one of the National Geographics. I think it was 5 years ago or so, where they were really promoting that. But sugarcane, as I understand, it's a documentary that was made in the wake of the alleged mass graves found outside of Kamloops, and it presents itself as this true crime documentary. But you've then produced, you've done some real research and produced your own documentary. So your documentary, The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane, was in response to that. So give us perhaps a little, what is your documentary about?
Well, what happened in the documentary Sugarcane is that it's basically weaving together two stories that are true, but leaving out a lot of details that would blow apart the thesis. And the story follows the Williams Lake Band, which is, I think it's about 300 kilometers north of Kamloops. So shortly after the Kamloops band said that they had found 215 human remains and mass graves of children as young as 3 in their orchard, right after that, Williams Lake said, well, we think that we also have missing children here and we're going to do a search. And ultimately they came up with a number of 93. And Sugarcane tends to follow the investigators from the Williams Lake Band. One woman is named Charlene Bellew, and the other is Whitney Spearing, who's an archaeologist with the band's company called Sugarcane Archaeology. So it's kind of a big promo for their business as well. Now, the human interest element is that there's a young man named Julian Brave Noisecat, who's also one of the directors of the film, and his friend Emily Cassie, who he'd worked with before at Huffington Post, I guess. When she heard about the Kamloops band, she thought, oh, I really want to do this kind of story, because she's done all kinds of investigative journalism around the world on very serious issues. So she called him up and said, well, why don't we do something together? And she just happened to fall upon a news story about Williams Lake. And it turns out that Julian's father was, as a baby, found in the garbage burner at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. So Sugarcane tries to present the story that priests impregnated students and then burned the unwanted newborns in the incinerator. So one part of the story is true. Julian's father was found in the garbage burner at the school in the summer. And actually, his mother put the baby there. And his mother spent a year in jail for abandoning the baby. The dairyman just happened to find it and take the baby to the hospital and save his life. So that part of the story is true, but no priest impregnated her. And there was a priest in the 1960s who did have an affair with a girl at the school, but that girl was a 22-year-old seamstress, an employee. So, there was an improper relationship there, but it was not with a student. It was a consenting adult.
Right, and there's nothing in it. So they, as you said, they've taken two separate stories from the same place and taken some facts from one story and some facts from another story and put them together to try to create this narrative about all these evil priests sexually abusing children and then having all these babies and incinerating them.
Right. And so you can see how this is creating a narrative that the reason why children's bodies have not been found is that they were all incinerated, which of course is ludicrous, because if you know anything about cremation, you have to have extremely high heat. And it would be unlikely that schools where many of the staff and sometimes the clergy were indigenous, were related to the children, it's very unlikely that they would let such horrible, criminal, heinous acts go on and not do anything about it.
Right. Well,
So
and I mean, this garbage incinerator, that would not be capable of incinerating the remains of a human being.
that's right. And so these two young filmmakers, Emily Cassie and Julian Brave Noisecat, Julian tries to reconnect with his father, who's as an adult is known as Ed Archie Noisecat. He's an indigenous carver, and the two of them kind of go on father-son journey trying to reconnect. And Julian wants to know the details of his father's story. And interestingly enough, his father says, you know, it just keeps damaging about his life story. And I would say that is definitely true of sugarcane, because this will do a lot of damage to many, many thousands of people. And I expect
Right.
many more churches to be burned.
Right.
I
And
you
as
know, people haven't seen it lately because it's shown at festivals. So it was at Windsor for one day. Tonight, actually, I think is playing at Dock NYC in New York. So it's played here and there for very short periods of time. So the critics have seen it. The critics are now spreading this narrative of
right.
priests
Well,
impregnating students and burning babies. It's
yeah,
all over
and
the
as
press.
right, and as you mentioned in your documentary, the critics, at least when you made it, it has 100% tomato on tomato meter score on Rotten Tomatoes. So the critics love it. Of course, they're going into it completely uncritically. I mean, it's National Geographic, so they're assuming, oh, this must all be true. And
Mhm.
it's interesting where you're saying how only the critics are watching, because they're going to spread that narrative. And how many people are not even going to watch the sugarcane documentary and just go off of what the critics say? Oh, well, now next thing you know, this is accepted knowledge.
Yeah.
This is just the way it is. Like, how dare you question this, you racist, if you go against what they say in the sugarcane documentary?
That's right. And they interview one fellow in sugarcane, and I think there's an article in the Vancouver Sun or Vancouver Province, and they're talking with Emily Cassie, the director, and they say, you know, this one fellow tells kind of a lurid story about a nun with a shoebox, and the lid falls off, a baby falls out, and then he sees her throw the baby into the school's furnace. And the only thing is, they say about him, oh, well, he's very damaged by what he saw, and no one's able to interview him because he lives in a remote place off grid. So, you as a criminal lawyer, I'm sure, you kind of go, oh, yeah, I can't interview anyone. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
well, yeah, and that's I mean, it's not evidence at all. The problem is these things are presented as gospel truth, but I mean, that's not even evidence. Like, that's a lack of evidence. It's innuendo and insinuation and speculation, and saying, oh, well, because he's damaged and we can't talk to him because he's in the remote area, it must be true, which is it's so backwards. That's the exact opposite way of how these things should be dealt with. And just before we get too much further, I think it kind of segues nicely to what I wanted to point out when I said how you're a potential future thought criminal, because all these things you're saying here, as you're saying them, I'm just thinking, like, literally, there's a potential that people could go to jail for having conversations like this in the not too distant future. So I'm just going to screen share that. What I'm referring to is Bill. Let me screen share here. It's Bill C-413, which is an act to amend the criminal code under the promotion of hatred against Indigenous peoples. So this is a private member's bill sponsored by Leah Gazan from Winnipeg Center, NDP. Unfortunately, I'm from Winnipeg, but sadly, I have to say that Winnipeg, unfortunately, has lots of NDP support in it. So this has gotten past first reading already. I had a look at the Hansard while I was waiting to start this video, and no one questioned it. It was just acclaimed after first reading. This needs to go in. So let's just look quickly at the text of the bill, because this is where I'm talking about how people could literally go to jail for having conversations like the one we're having. because they want to amend the hate crime section to say that everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, and of course we're having a public conversation because it's live streamed, willfully promotes hatred against Indigenous peoples by condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the Indian residential school system in Canada, or by misrepresenting facts relating to it. So this is the kicker here, misrepresenting facts relating to it.
Like the sugarcane filmmakers did. Actually, they should be going to
but
jail.
the problem is,
yeah, I know.
Yeah, I agree. They're the ones who are misrepresenting, but the problem is, I think we know, like, the way that their documentary is being received, their version is what would be considered truth, and what your documentary says and what we're saying in this discussion would be considered, I believe, misrepresenting facts relating to residential schools. So, I mean, now another huge problem with this law, and it's the same problem I have with the law prohibiting any questioning of any aspect of the Holocaust. Actually, it's even worse. The Holocaust, the definition is just so vague and broad that you don't know what you're not allowed to discuss, and it's totally unclear what would run afoul of that law. Here, they don't even define what the Indian residential school system is at all, let alone what the narrative is. So misrepresenting facts, it's impossible to know the law, and it just leaves it so open for abuse that it's really anyone who says something that the people in power don't like, you can now go to jail as a thought criminal if that becomes law. I think it's unlikely that it'll make it all the way to royal assent by the time there's an election, but given how easily it blew through first reading, I wouldn't be surprised if the private member who introduced it is re-elected, because she's NDP, she's not Liberal, and I grew up in Winnipeg, I know Winnipeg well. They'll never not vote NDP in that part of the city. So she might have another kick at the can. So I mean, as a journalist, what do you think of laws like this?
Well, you know, you have to be able to discuss things openly, because many times, I even look at criminal cases where people have gone to jail, convicted of a crime, a heinous crime, murder, rape, whatever. And then because people are able to do more research and get more details, that conviction is often overturned because they were wrongly accused and wrongly convicted, but it's only because people can ask questions about it. You know, I think one of the things that people are not recognizing in this case is that China accused Canada of genocide at the UN with about 5 other despot nations beside them. This was brought to people's attention in Terry Glavin's article, The Year of the Graves. Now, China still accuses Canada of genocide, and they used the Kamloops find, or alleged find, as evidence. So they're going to use this as evidence. They're going to use the recent report by Kimberly Murray, which goes way off the rails, as evidence, when all of these are contrivances. So, you know, just imagine if Canada had some kind of international embargo against us, like South Africa did during apartheid. You know, think what that could do to our economy. Or if people made the claim, okay, this proves genocide, therefore we should have all of our land back. You know, which is the thrust also in subtly in the film Sugarcane. So, you know, these narratives are framing a much bigger international story. And unfortunately, I think most of the politicians, especially the conservative politicians, are afraid of getting the same treatment that Lynn Bayak did, where she got booted out of the Senate for saying that Indian residential schools offered much good to people, which they did. I'm going to say it here too.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, again, we may go to jail for saying things like this sometime, but back in Winnipeg, there's lots of Indigenous people in Winnipeg. I worked alongside lawyers who are Indigenous people, and they said to me, and one of my professors, I remember even saying, that, you know, they learned things in the residential school. That's how they ended up getting university degrees and being lawyers. Now, I mean, this was over 20 years ago. So even back then, it kind of had to be said quietly, but it wasn't the same. I mean, now I don't think they would even risk saying that quietly, because even they would probably be destroyed as some sort of traitor to their own people for acknowledging that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really a huge tragedy that is a big part of this. There's something like, what, 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada, 1.8, 1.2, something like that. And a very large number of them are Christians or Roman Catholics. And I think that, first of all, with these first lurid announcements, their faith was probably pretty shattered. But also because these communities are quite small, you know, there's now this setup of those who believe in that the priests and nuns were horrible people, and those who know they were not and love their faith, but they're unable to really practice and enjoy their faith in the way that they did before, both because of social pressure and because of all the ongoing lurid stories about Indian residential schools.
Right. And then, I mean, given the fact that we're even at the point where we're even talking about making it illegal to say anything other than that, it becomes a real problem, because we'll potentially have laws founded upon demonstrable lies, and you go to jail if you question that narrative, even though it's based on lies, and you're not allowed to present any other dissenting viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that residential schools saved the lives of thousands of orphans. And I do believe personally that many people did suffer, but I think they suffered ambiguous losses. And I've got a collection of essays on that, where, you know, a person dies, suddenly you don't have an opportunity to properly grieve. Like if you're a child, you're swept away to a school because your parents passed away. A lot of people died of TB back in the day. Whole families were wiped out by TB. So you have these ambiguous losses piling up in the background of your family. And then you're swept away to a new environment, which may be very traumatic. For some people, it was a lifesaver. For others, it was very traumatic. But nonetheless, these children were given sustenance and love and food and education and clothing and things that they, you know, if they were left alone. And there's a story of one woman in my little documentary who was left alone in the world. All of her family died. And so she was just going from elder to elder, sort of helping them around the house, and they'd give her a bit of food in return. And that's how she was living until she got to Indian residential school, which she said was the best experience of her entire life. Because, you know, there were things to do, people cared about her, she had a safe place to live, she wasn't constantly begging. So, you know, there's so much more to the story that we're not being told. And it's really a shame. Where would those orphans have gone? You know, many of these families had 10, 15 children. People don't know that. The Indigenous families were very big back then. And so a lot of times sending the kids to Indian residential school was a saving for the whole family, because imagine trying to feed that many children. There's one story I've seen with a woman who talks about how when she was 6, she was taken away to residential school in a cattle truck. And so this sounds terrible. And the interviewer says, you had no choice? She said, no, I had no choice. I wanted to stay with my grandfather. And then she's further in the conversation, she says, well, why were you with your grandfather? And she said, well, my mother and father had died, and so had my grandfather. So my grandfather was taking care of the 4 of us and 9 others. So can you imagine one elderly man with like 13 children to care for?
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible, but people don't understand that historical context at all.
Yeah, and I mean, just other things, like, I think it would be difficult for any child, no matter what, to be in a situation where they can't live with their parents. Like if their parents are dead, I mean, that's no one's fault, but it would still be difficult for them. And even if they went somewhere that was, loving and providing for them, no one is going to be able to replace one's actual parents. So they would still have some difficult memories. But I mean, I feel like in your research, I think you're hinting that maybe you see this as well. But as you're talking, it sounds to me like whoever it is that is wanting to push this narrative about how evil and awful Canada is and how bad our heritage is and how we did this genocide and killed all these Indigenous people, they're actually re-victimizing and taking advantage of vulnerable people. And I mean, it kind of puts me in mind of the whole transgender movement as well, where very vulnerable people are being targeted and taken advantage of to push this narrative and being re-victimized as a result.
Yes, I would agree with that. And it's really cruel because many of these children, of course, would have had imprinted on them that death and burial when their parents or family members passed away, and then they were whisked off to school. So I see there being a strong connection there as to why all these stories of mystery graveyards and such like pop up. And then, of course, when you have children together and they're talking about things, people add on to the story and it becomes its own little urban legend. Not to mention, as you said, the loss, the grief, the complicated grief that's not being dealt with. And I have some background in psychology studies and counseling. I was a career counselor for quite a few years, which has some related courses. And what I see is that people are blaming the Indian residential schools, but they're not dealing with the grief, the complicated grief, the layers and layers, decades of grief. Because, if you go back historically, say to when the Mounties came west, many Indigenous bands were being almost completely wiped out by smallpox. And I think it was Reverend McDougall in Calgary, in the Calgary area. He adopted 17 children because their families had died of smallpox. So, and the Spanish flu also, when it hit in 1918, it actually took young adults rather than the elderly or the children. So there were lots of children who were orphaned then from Spanish flu. And that happened almost in a day. Like quite often the flu would hit somebody in the morning, they'd be dead by night. So, these dramatic layers and layers of historic losses within a family, I don't think have ever been dealt with.
Well, and the interesting thing, you just mentioned the smallpox. I was just reading about that recently. The whole, there's this whole urban legend, or I don't know if it's urban legend, this legend and myth about white people purposely taking the blankets from smallpox victims and giving them to Indigenous communities to purposely give them smallpox. I did a bit of research into that recently, and there's only one record. It's just 2 letters exchanged between 2 officers where one of them just mentioned this as an idea or a possibility, but no discussion of actually implementing it, no discussion of anyone else having ever done that. There's no evidence anywhere else of this ever having actually happened. And that conversation in those letters was actually well after a lot of these smallpox outbreaks. So again, that's something that's presented as, the settlers were purposely trying to genocide people, whereas like back then they didn't have the same understanding of germs or contagion that we do now, and smallpox didn't impact the settlers the same way as the local population because they had generational antibodies. So they're just living their life, not thinking, to them I'm dangerous. I just, they don't know, but that's another thing that's been promoted, is like, this is established truth that smallpox blankets were given purposely to wipe out Indigenous groups, and that's just not the case.
That's right. And the other thing that is missing in most conversations about residential schools is the fact that until about the 1950s, tuberculosis was the biggest killer of all people, not just Indigenous people, although the rates were higher there, but all people. In George Werett's book, the miracle of the empty beds, he writes that in 1908 in Canada, 1 Canadian died every hour of TB and 2 died every hour of the night from TB. So it was taking a tremendous toll. And I always recommend to people, please, please, please watch the PBS documentary called The Forgotten Plague. Because although it's set in the States, it very much mirrors what happened in Canada. And you will see how incredibly horrific it was in society. And how people actually often planned their lives around whether or not they would get TB. And many times, there's a book called Living in the Shadow of Death by, I think it's Sheila Rothman. And she goes through the diary of a woman on the East Coast in the States who was raising her children in a very, very disciplined way and teaching them useful things like mending clothing, household duties, doing laundry, all the most useful things that a domestic or that a handyman would do around the yard. And she did that because she was convinced that she would get TB because other people in her family had it. And if she died, she hoped that the orphaned children would be taken in by friends or relatives and provide a useful skill, right? And be very well behaved, because the alternative was either the poorhouse or the street. Like there were no real social services until about the 1960s, 70s, anywhere. So, people have to understand the context of the time. But that documentary about the Forgotten Plague will really help set perspective.
Well, that's definitely one I encourage viewers to look at. And while we're speaking documentaries, I've put in the comments section on Facebook and on YouTube the link to the documentary that Michelle did, The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane, and I urge people to watch that as well. Especially watch it while it's still legal to do so, because as we've discussed, there may come a time where that'll be a forbidden work and will be proverbially burnt. I mean, they don't have a physical book or a tape that they need to burn in the age of digital videos, since it's on Rumble. But I mean, figuratively speaking, that they would be doing book burnings when they make if they end up making books like that or videos like that illegal. So I recommend people to watch that. So we're running near to the end of our time here, but just out of interest, I don't know if you've thought about this, Michelle. If a law like this does come to pass, where it becomes illegal to discuss these things, have you given thought to? Are you still going to talk about them and risk the wrath, or do you think it's better to maybe just? I mean, you're still allowed private conversations, to have private conversations rather than, maybe becoming some sort of martyr publicly.
Well, I don't really want to become a martyr, but I think it's important that we speak to the truth of history. And it's a multifaceted thing. It's very broad. And if nobody speaks up, then, we will become victims of silence. So it's kind of like Lysenkoism. You can see how far that went. It ended up with millions of Ukrainians being starved to death. And you can see where Mao took the great leap forward. He took an entire country backward and killed about 40 million of his own people because people were not allowed to speak up. So if we don't speak up now, we may never see the light of day. And again, I want to reiterate that I do really care about the Indigenous people of Canada. I think that a terrible thing is happening to them, to their psyche, to the young people who, now don't know who to trust. If residential schools were so bad, then what does that mean for going to university to a young Indigenous person? Because isn't a university just another kind of Indian residential school? It's created, it's put a pall over relationships between Indigenous and European based ethnicities in Canada. And it's really stuck a wedge, a big dagger into the heart of Canada. and it's
Yeah,
wrong. It's
yeah,
false.
it has, and yeah, and they talk about truth and reconciliation, but that's what's real. There's neither truth nor reconciliation going on because they're, as you say, there's a wedge. They're pushing people apart. I mean, again, growing up in Winnipeg, where there's a very large Indigenous population, I knew lots of Indigenous people, and we got along fine. I'd be surprised if people have that good of relationships with each other among young people now,
Yeah.
in places like that, with all of this kind of stuff and animosity going up. And I mean, they're really being told to hate the white people who are around now, whereas like we had nothing to do with the residential. I mean, even if they were as bad as they say, like I had nothing to do with that. My family didn't even move to Canada until after World War II. So it's unfortunate because I would rather see people in Canada working together, working on a way forward, rather than these animosities and divisions being built up.
And it's not like Canadians have not done anything to try and mitigate or compensate for the claims of harms. I think we've paid out several $billion in personal compensation, and there are something like $76 billion in various land claims and other kinds of claims that are outstanding, for a population of 1.8 million Indigenous people.
Mhm.
So it's not like Canada hasn't tried to say, Canada has said they're sorry for the bad things that did happen. And the Pope has said he's sorry on behalf of the church, and compensation has been paid. So, at what point do we go forward instead of going backward? Because as we
Mhm.
go forward, the claims become more and more lurid, as with sugarcane, and as you say, the reconciliation falls by the wayside.
Yeah, and it always strikes me as interesting that the further we get away from a time, somehow we have more knowledge of it. Now that all the people who actually lived through it aren't around anymore, or far fewer of them are around. Yet they're somehow saying we know more than what was known then. But I mean, that's maybe a whole other topic of discussion. But thank you very much for joining me on the show. There's been a very interesting conversation, and I think it's especially important to have these conversations while we still can, and hopefully that having these conversations openly, as you suggested, could prevent it getting to a point where we're not allowed to have these conversations without worrying about going to jail. So thank you again for joining me, and for our viewers, thank you as always for joining us. No legal advice was given in this video, but of course, none of my videos are legal advice, but always call a lawyer if you need legal advice. And we're always interested in show topic suggestions, so you can leave those in the comment box or email us. We've got the email address going on the bottom of the screen right now. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking it. And we'd really appreciate if you'd subscribe, and then you could have access as we have more videos. Hopefully we can do some more interviews like this. And then, of course, we have our regular weekly shows covering a variety of legal topics. So thank you again, Michelle, and thank you to our viewers for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nicholas.